Welcome to the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday episode. I'm your host, Aman Carney, and I'm going to talk about pretty much the Super Bowl. And yes, I did say Wednesday because no more Friday episodes. They're moving to Wednesday just to make it easier to record everything because we are posting shorts daily and then weekly on Saturdays on Spotify and Apple. F1 will be introduced to the podcast soon if you guys didn't tune in to the Saturday episode over on Spotify and Apple exclusively. But without further ado, let's get it started, man. The Niners Chiefs will start on the Niners side, the losing side, and I was just baffled by the play calling early in the third quarter because even though the Niners defense was going at it, limiting Patrick Mahomes in that offense, you you just find yourself questioning the play calling on the offensive side, and then on defense early in the fourth and throughout that fourth quarter, it's like, why aren't you why aren't you calling the right plays like Steve Wilkes, even Kyle Shanahan being the deciding factor there because obviously he's the head coach. Everything has to be approved by him. And the play calling sort of by Steve Wilkes, especially in the waning moments of the fourth quarter and even overtime when the Chiefs did go on to win the game. It's like, what are we doing here? And then for the fact that Christian McCaffrey, who finished the game with 80 rushing yards and 80 passing yards and a touchdown, why aren't you using your best player? And I get you average 3 yards a rush, but that takes off way more time off the clock than if you were to run a pass play and only chew out like 4 or 5 seconds. But if it's a rush play, that's like at least 30 seconds just off the clock, just like that. So you rush on first and second and then pass on third down, depending on what happened the previous play, or you still pass on second down, depending on how the first rush was, or your confidence. And I just feel like Kyle Shanahan has had leads like as an offensive coordinator 28-3, and even though he was the offensive coordinator, he was still calling the play. And why Dan Quinn actually approved them and was the sort of the head of that team as a head coach, I don't know why, but it was still Kyle Shanahan calling those plays. And then when you're up 21-10 against the Chiefs in the previous Super Bowl they met in Miami, why aren't you calling jet sweep for Debo Samuel or running plays for Raheem Mostert more to protect the lead? Like, there's no reason to go for pass plays at that point because Jimmy Garoppolo was an average quarterback, and that defense was carrying them all pretty much all playoffs. Raheem Mostert had that monster game where I think he got for like 250 something rushing yards, 4 touchdowns, like some absurd stat line. And you're moving away from that. Fast forward to the Super Bowl, you're up 10-3 at halftime. Nice defensive game. Like I thought Chase Young at one point was Super Bowl MVP after the McCaffrey fumble and or Nick Bosa, and then McCaffrey stepped it up. I thought it was McCaffrey, and then Jawan Jennings passed and received a touchdown. So I was voting for Jawan Jennings, and then all of a sudden Patrick Mahomes just comes in, does his thing, and it's almost like the Chiefs have to play from behind in every single playoff game. They were obviously down 24 against the Texans way back when, down 10 against the Titans, down 10 against the Niners now, twice in two of out of the three Mahomes Super Bowls, down 10 against the Eagles in the third or start of the fourth quarter or something like that. And it's just like, how do they keep pulling this off? And for overtime, Kyle Shanahan pretty much laid out their strategy, but for the players to not even be aware of the overtime rules, like that's the most baffling part to me. And honestly, they started first. It was looking like were gonna score a touchdown for sure until the Chiefs' red zone defense happened, and they were 6 yards away. And even though the Niners' defense got rest, it was too much to stop Patrick Mahomes, and you had this is when Steve Wilkes' decision making comes into question and play calling comes into question because you have two third and longs. Just get two more stops and you win the game, you win the Super Bowl. And now Kyle Shanahan approved those plays. They did get it together towards the end, but that was when the Chiefs were already gaining all the momentum in the world. And then it just became so obvious, like 3 plays before the game ending touchdown, that it was looking like a Chiefs touchdown. Shanahan's strategy does make sense that they score first, they score a touchdown first, the Chiefs score a touchdown, and then the Niners had a chance to answer when it became the second, I guess, period or second quarter, however you want to call it, in overtime, because that literally went down to the wire. They scored with like 3 seconds left in the first period, but even if they didn't, they still would have had more time. And honestly, it was just so crazy to me to see how things unfolded because Brock Purdy, he was a difference maker for most of the season, but he was just playing good enough. And that doesn't cut it in the Super Bowl. He didn't make any game-changing plays. He could have, but he overthrew Deebo Samuel and Ayuk, I believe, both in the end zone, if I'm not mistaken, because the Chiefs applied a lot of pressure on those plays, but the only like sort of great plays Purdy made was like getting out of sacks, making good throws. He was making great decisions, but I completely disagree with not using your weapons for most of the third quarter and fourth quarter. And Christian McCaffrey, he was the first player in Super Bowl history to get 80 rush yards, 80 passing yards, and a touchdown. Basically meaning 160 scrimmage yards, a receiving touchdown. Like, he was clearly your best player that game on offense. And it was between him, Juwan Jennings, Chase Young, or Nick Bosa. Had they won, one of those four players would have been Super Bowl MVP. Probably Juwan Jennings if I had to vote. But then the play calling, man, that's all I could point towards. I don't know if it's really on Brock Purdy. He's probably confused himself, like why am I passing? Why am I passing? But he obviously can't challenge the coach, right? He's too young for that. And it was honestly just unfortunate because even the pass plays you did call, like Debo, Ayuk, and Kittle, they weren't the difference makers they normally were. Christian McCaffrey was the only difference maker on the field, and credit to the Chiefs' defense for limiting everyone but McCaffrey. And when that's happening, play through McCaffrey. McCaffrey can clearly handle it. He finally had his first fully healthy season in a while, and on the Panthers, he was responsible for like 80% of their offense. That should have been him in the third quarter running. And honestly, you can't stop Jake Moody from, even though it was blocked, it was kind of on him for kicking it low. But you can't stop that. That was ultimately the deciding factor in the end. And in overtime, I would have gone second, to be honest, because even though your defense would have gotten rest, your offense would have seen, like, all right, I need to go down, score a field goal to either tie the game or win, depending on if the Chiefs scored first, or if it's a touchdown, then you'd have that extra opportunity to go for it on fourth down. And I understand that Mahomes would have gotten the ball with a chance to win it outright after the first two possessions if the Chiefs did go first. But I found it highly unlikely that the Chiefs would answer back if it did go to a second period. And I would have gone second. That's my opinion. I do agree with, also agree. So I understand why they went for it first. But for the players on the Niners not to be aware of the overtime rules, I feel like that definitely played a factor. That was just baffling to listen to. Kyle Shanahan said the strategy, but apparently none of the players on the defense and offensive side weren't notified or aware of the rules. I don't know how, like, that rule has been in the NFL for like a few seasons now. Obviously, it was the first time using them, but we should still be aware of all the rule changes. So that was just baffling, and that may have been a factor playing in the Niners' minds. Like, oh wow, so it's not going to end the game if we score a touchdown here. Like, that was just baffling to me through the simple fact, like, that probably had an effect on their minds, and it's just crazy to me. But as for the Chiefs, man, Patrick Mahomes, he's on pace to surpass Brady if you look at the stats. And yes, Brady was on the bench for the first part of his career, maybe first season or two, but Mahomes, man, Travis Kelsey, they're one of the deadliest duos in NFL history. Both of them have 3 rings. Mahomes, 3 Super Bowl MVPs, all the stats. Like, it was just crazy. He showed that he can adapt, and the Niners simply got out coached, and Mahomes obviously outperformed Purdy, in my opinion, but that was more so because Shanahan just outright got out coached. Reed, he saw what was going wrong and adapted. And so they came back from being down 10 and 10-0 with a lot of time left in the game. Like, that's not really like a 10-point lead, if you know what I'm saying. You don't feel like your team's dominating because it was still a defensive show, like, for sure. But Reed showed his ability to adapt, and Shanahan do what was working. You rushed quite a bit. Like, you were making great play calls. Just do that again in the second half, but just make more of your plays rush. We're not saying to not pass it, and I get it was 3 rushing yards per attempt, but at a certain point, you call more rush plays than pass plays in the second half. That's how you protect the lead while still moving the ball downfield to get more points on the board. And Shanahan didn't show any ability to adapt under pressure yet again. And I feel like the Niners, their championship window is still definitely open, but now, I mean, it's completely fair to call the Kansas City Chiefs a dynasty for sure. Mahomes, one of the greatest QBs of all time. Kelsey, one of the greatest tight ends of all time. But as my take on how everything went, I'm sure you're going to hear Evan soon talk about it as well. And the Shorts Daily, make sure to follow us everywhere. Thank you for listening.